project and bring people and ideas together to help partners across different sectors to get to grips with understanding and managing the potential impacts of climate change on their communities, businesses, operations, local areas, strategies and plans. We're very pleased to be able to contribute this session to the Schools Climate Summit. We know that weather is already increasingly affecting critical infrastructure, including schools, causing disruption and discomfort to pupils and staff. And we know that there's helpful evidence, experience and learning out there that can help us mitigate the impacts and ensure that school environments are healthy and resilient places for those occupying them. And we're absolutely delighted to have an excellent panel of speakers from policy and practice to share the work they've done in this space. We'll hear about ways in which weather and climate affect schools, about guidance and policy to ensure that our schools are resilient. And we'll also hear about cases of real life work happening to adapt schools. We're going to be recording this session. We know there aren't many of you here, but we want to make it available as a resource for those who are at one of presumably the many other events going on right now as we speak. And please feel free to use the chat function for any questions and comments you might like to add to the discussion. What I'm going to do is I'm going to we've got 4 short presentations that are going to take about 15 minutes each. And we'll just take all of those and then have Q&A right at the end, I think. So we're going to start with a presentation on how schools can adapt to climate change from Annette Figueiredo, Principal Policy and Programme Officer at the GLA, and Dan Bicknell, who is also a Principal Policy and Programme Officer at the GLA. Annette has a background in environmental, social and health policy and delivery work in London, and she's been at the GLA across 3 different mayoral administrations, so she must know it all inside out by now. She's worked previously in the third sector and also holds a non-substantive role within the NHS and a volunteer trustee role on a charity board. And Annette has been a school governor for a junior school in her local community. Dan is a chartered environmental specialist leading on climate change adaptation for the mayor at City Hall. He has over 15 years experience working on climate change, resilience and water policy and programmes for international organisations and national and city government. Over to Dan and Annette.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen briefly. Thanks for the introductions, Louise. Just give me 2 seconds to share what we've got here. Just a nod if you can see that.
That's perfect, thank you.
The mode. Yep, so what we're going to do a bit of a double act, Annette and myself. We both sit in the same part of the climate change team on the adaptation side of the team. I lead on kind of all aspects of adaptation, but specialise in sort of water, and Annette is our policy lead for heat. And in terms of outline today, I'll give you some very brief climate context and very, very briefly tell you about sort of what City Hall's doing. Many of you will be familiar with what City Hall's doing since the pandemic on the environment agenda and more broadly around the London recovery. But then we're going to talk a lot more specifically in this session around some guidance that we've produced for schools on adaptation, one on adaptation plans for schools, and then I'm going to drill down in a bit more detail in the SUDS sector guidance that we produced recently and focus specifically on the reimagining rainwater in schools piece. So Annette, if okay with you, I'll just give some very brief background and then I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Sure, thanks Dan.
Sorry, I just had a pop-up jump up. Tell me if the slides have disappeared, but hopefully they're still there.
They're still there.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I mean, many of you will be familiar with this. In terms of London's climate, we're expecting warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers, and more intense rainfall, both in the winter and in summer periods, but also long extended dry spells, which is likely to, cause all sorts of issues, both with our built environment and challenges for our public realm as well. And we need to think about how we adapt both sort of our public open spaces, our green spaces, but also our buildings, both in terms of our domestic building stock and commercial and non-residential building stock, public sector buildings, schools and so on, to the impacts of climate change. We're expecting temperatures in London specifically because of intensified urban heat island effect to increase, with projected increases in average monthly temperatures by 2050 of around 5 to 6 degrees in summer. This will have a quite significant impact on critical infrastructure, of which schools is one, but also on sort of transport infrastructure and other areas as well. Our London Plan, which recently adopted London Plan, which is the Mayor's spatial plan for housing growth in London, has quite significant targets for growth, but also needs to consider the impacts of climate change. And as part of the evidence base to inform the London Plan, is supported by a regional flood risk appraisal, which identifies critical infrastructure at risk of flooding. And within that, we've got the statistic that 643 of London's 2,895 schools, 22%, are either wholly or partially at risk of fluvial, tidal and or surface water flooding. That's quite a high level figure, and there's some quite significant caveats around that figure, particularly around tidal flood risk, which is very well defended, and to a lesser extent fluvial flood risk as well. But certainly for surface water flood risk, which is particularly challenging to both predict and defend against, we have some quite high levels of flood risk to public sector buildings and schools too. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in my presentation. And I just want to say very briefly just a bit about the kind of current landscape that we're operating in relative to where we were a couple of years ago since the pandemic. And many of you on the call are likely to be, or listening, are likely to be aware of this, or at least partially involved in this. The Mayor has launched the London Recovery Board and the London Recovery Programme, which sets out 9 missions to drive London's recovery. And it's very much about a green recovery, but it's all about jobs and boosting London's economy in the bounce back from COVID, and really coming back stronger with a greener and more resilient London. So a lot of the work that we're doing now and a lot of the programs that we're currently developing are centered around one of those missions. There are 9 missions in all that tackle different elements of kind of urban resilience and the urban economy and bouncing back. But the one that we're working in particularly or across is the Green New Deal mission, and we're cutting across some of the other missions as well. And within the Green New Deal mission, we have 3 primary themes under which most of our programs sit. So we've got the transport and public realm theme, we've got a built environment theme, and we've got a sort of green financing and green recovery theme under which most of our work sits. So that's a bit of a kind of watch this space in terms of some of the SUDS work that I'm talking about later on will also be delivered through these Green New Deal programs as well. So Annette, I think over to you to talk about the first set of guidance. I think you might be on mute, Annette.
First one this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Dan, and thank you. As Dan has mentioned, I'm going to present on how London schools and early years settings can adapt to climate change, explain the guidance that we commissioned by AREP last year and why we commissioned it, a little bit about how COVID interrupted but then presented an opportunity to us, some of which Dan has already covered, what's come out for the guidance, recommendation and measures, and then future approach in the context of London Climate Action Week and the London Schools Summit, which was launched this morning. Thanks, Dan. Okay, so why did we commission the guidance? Well, as Dan has already mentioned, we know climate change is an issue for London. It's an issue globally, but it's also an issue for London. And we know from the evidence that climate change in London is going to cause more frequent and widespread water capacity, heat risk and flooding. We also know that the impacts are going to be disproportionate and unequal in London. So we know that the risks associated with climate change, for London anyway, are around water scarcity, flood risk and heat. And we know that the groups are most impacted are the elderly and the vulnerable, but children in particular. And we also know that those in poverty are also impacted because they have less adaptive capacity to adapt their homes and adapt quickly as well. And we know that those who live isolated, alone, find it much more difficult, possibly, to respond and recover from the impacts of climate change. So we know there are particular groups that are disproportionately impacted. We also know children in particular find it much more difficult to adjust behaviours, and we cannot just leave them to get on and respond to a heat event or to flood risk, and they're dependent on teachers and other adults for guidance. The other reason we commissioned this guidance is because we have the London Environment Strategy. It's an evidence-based policy strategy. So we've done all the evidence base, we've done an integrated impact assessment with the strategy, which tells us how our policy will impact negatively and positively on certain groups. And the policy has a very strong strand in the adaptation section, which states very clearly that the Mayor will want to build resilience to climate impacts and protect people and the environment through the city. And so this was another key driver for this guidance. And then finally, this guidance is the first of its kind. No other city has done it, and we're hopeful that other cities will follow in our footsteps. Thanks. A little bit of data. This is quite old data. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any data that was more up to date. So here's a window of opportunity for anyone who works in data. But in 2007, flooding in England resulted in widespread closure of schools. There were 400,000 lost pupil days and an estimated cost of 12 million to the government and to the country, and that was excluding damage to property. We also know that in 2006, when temperatures reached a record high, 36 Celsius in the UK, teachers began to send pupils home on health and safety grounds. We also know anecdotally that this has happened subsequently in heat waves, most recently last year and the year before. Thanks, Dan. So just as we commissioned this guidance, we had commissioned Arab and we started working on this, and COVID very nicely came along and interrupted our work. However, there were analogies to be drawn from the response to COVID. So this guidance is an important piece of work which highlights the need for green policies to build stronger communities, a more resilient critical infrastructure that can help Londoners, particularly those at risk, prepare, recover and respond to extreme events, weather being one, COVID being another. So there were very clear similarities, although different approaches. Dan has already mentioned that the response by the Mayor has been to develop a recovery plan. And within that recovery plan, there are 9 missions. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the missions, and Dan's already mentioned the Green New Deal, which aims to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies and improve air quality by doubling the size of London's green economy by 2030 to accelerate job creation for all. And it's this bit's important because in relation to schools and resilience, we're really pushing that more work needs to be done in schools on this particular issue through the Green New Deal. And there are a number of objectives within the Green New Deal, which is about improving London's natural environment, improving air quality. And some of you may be familiar that we've already done 2 pieces of work in terms of reducing exposure by school children to poor air quality. We've done the Mayor's School Air Quality Audit reports and also the nursery air quality reports, which are on the GLA's website. We also want to tackle the climate and ecological emergency, all of which schools have an important part to play. The Green New Deal also will promote and incentivise activities that sustain and grow London's green economy, We'll prioritise interventions reducing health inequalities and social injustices, and we will engage Londoners and businesses in the journey to become a zero pollution and greener city. But that also includes adaptation. So adaptation is very much part of the mitigation agenda in terms of reducing carbon and moving towards a net zero city. So COVID presented opportunities. We're all aware how impactful it was negatively, but it also presented opportunities and allows us to really focus on how London's recovery can really focus on building up a better environment, particularly for those at risk and with a focus on school children. Thanks, Dan. So what did the guidance come up with? So the really important strand in the guidance is that it's aimed at the whole school community and year setting. And that means that it's looking at the whole school in terms of kind of the physical infrastructure. So looking internally as well as externally, the school grounds and the buildings, the sites around the school. But it's also holistic in terms of leadership. The guidance very much focuses on this isn't just about teachers and pupils, but it's about the governing body, it's about the ancillary staff, it's about the volunteers involved in the school. So it's about mobilisation and taking a much more holistic school approach to developing a plan in terms of being able to respond to a extreme climate event. When we commissioned Arup, we were very strong in ensuring that we had stakeholder engagement and that both the schools and early years setting communities were involved in informing the guidance. So there were a number of schools and early years settings which were consulted, and then got engaged. We were slightly hampered because of COVID and the fact that schools and early years settings were closed, but nonetheless we were able to work with some. As already mentioned, the focus is on heat risk, flood risk and water scarcity. And in terms of what it actually suggests, there are 6 steps towards a clear school climate adaptation plan. And these are understanding the risks and setting priorities, preparing the school for climate change, so kind of being really clear what are the risks, what's the evidence showing us, what's the data saying, responding to and recovering from severe events for each of the 3 risks mentioned. And then there's a section on learning and raising awareness. So kind of how do you kind of bring the whole school on board so it's not just focused on the classroom. There's a delivery and funding section. One of the things that we learned from the school air quality audit and nursery audit reports is that schools were really hungry, real appetite for doing this work, but many of them are strapped for cash, and so they were really keen on being able to see where they could maximise funding opportunities. And then lastly is, it's great if you've come up with an adaptation plan, but then how do you monitor and evaluate? Again, one of the learnings from the Mayor's School Air Quality Audit reports was that we know that schools are under enormous pressure and sometimes this agenda falls at the bottom of the pile. And so what schools asked us when we were doing the audit reports was to come up with an easy, straightforward checklist that they could work with the host community on and be able to kind of get everybody engaged by using the checklist. So at Appendix 4 in the guidance, we have an easy to use checklist. And then in terms of planning the adaptation approach, it's about understanding climate risks, the school site, establishing priorities, funding, delivery aspects, and then making it happen, really kind of being able to kind of translate from the plan into action. Thanks, Dan. So what are the measures? As some of you might be familiar with these measures. Thanks, Louise. So in terms of the school grounds, things like rain planters, rain gardens, planting trees, etc., they're there in front of you. And then there are building measures, much more harder, tangible measures, which often require funding, such as cool roofs, green-blue walls, dual flush, etc. Thanks, Dan. I won't go through this because I know we're strapped for time, but there are other measures such as learning and raising awareness, integrating into lesson plans, behaviour change, And in terms of a quote, we had a head teacher say, we touch on climate change in different parts of the curriculum, for example, in philosophy for children, which we use to develop children's critical thinking skills. In the guidance in table 3, there's a selection of free online education resources, which again is very useful for anyone, not just for teachers. And then dotted throughout the guidance are case examples. Thanks, Dan. And then finally, in terms of the theme that's running through the London Climate Summer is there's a real hunger for this kind of work, and what we're trying to encourage, what the School Summit is trying to encourage, is a holistic approach and being able to mobilise the whole school community. So the strand that was cited this morning was think like a system, act as a sector. Thank you.
Hi, Louise. Time check wise, how long have we got to the end of our session before I launch into another couple of slides? Or
really only a couple of minutes, I'm afraid,
okay.
Dan.
I think what I'll do is I'll probably summarize. I mean, what I was going to do, and I probably have too many slides anyhow, and happy to share them afterwards, is I was just going to mention one set of guidance we produced. So the Mayor's taking a kind of twin prong approach to tackling surface water flood risk in London. And the London plan that I mentioned is pretty much taking care of new development. It's got really strong policies in the London plan that ensure a high standard of SUDs that are delivered through new development. But that only accounts for about 0.5% of land surface area every year. So we're really pushing the retrofit approach, but with very modest budgets. And part of the Mayor's London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan is about encouraging different sectors to install SUDs. And as part of that programme, we produced a series of sector guidance documents, one of which is for schools. And so I think rather than go through the background of what SUDs are and how they benefit, I think here's the list of the different sector documents. The school ones I find particularly interesting because it really focuses on the specifics of typical school sites, the fact that you often have large roof areas, large paved areas, significant numbers of downpipes that you can disconnect. But interestingly, it's what you do in terms of integrating that for reducing surface water flood risk, improving drainage capacity in the area, but also critically engaging the children in the school as well. And so, it's about creative design of appropriate schemes that both manage water but become an education resource as well. And I think that's where the opportunities lie. So just quickly to flag then, that within this guidance document for the schools one specifically, there are lots of tools and resources for teachers to help in decision making to design the right sorts of SUDs for your school. And it considers the school sites, it considers constrained sites as well as sites with an abundance of green space, it really is quite a useful resource for both for teachers, but also for sort of managing rainwater on the site and contributing to reducing London's flood risk. I think I'll leave it there, and I can share details of where the guidance document sits afterwards.
Thanks very much, Dan and Annette. That was really interesting. I'm very interested to hear that London's the only city with specific guidance for schools. So that's well done, London, on that. We're now going to move on to overheating, and Tim Taylor is going to talk about overheating risk under future climate scenarios and climate change adaptation for schools. Tim is a chartered engineer whose professional focus is building physics and environmental design. During a secondment in the Department for Education, he coordinated a working group for climate change adaptation that aimed to assess the impact of future climate projections on overheating risk in schools. He's going to be starting a new role at Cundall Consulting Engineers on 26th of July. So good luck to Tim for that. And here he goes on his talk.
That's great. Thank you very much, Louise, for the introduction. So without further ado, Kristen, can you move on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, sorry. Did I bring up the slide? I was trying to share it.
You've got the edit view rather than that's better. Thank you.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you for that.
I am.
Okay, so today I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to the climate data and policy that are essentially shaping the UK's response to climate change adaptation before moving on to the main topic of the presentation, which, as alluded to in Louise's introduction, really covers the key findings of an industry working group which looked at summertime overheating risk in schools under potential future climate scenarios. I'll then introduce some new design guidance for schools before reflecting briefly on the opportunities that exist for adapting both new and existing school buildings. So next slide, please, Kristen. So I'm going to start with a few words on climate change terminology. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with them already, but in simple terms, the changes that are already locked into the climate system by historic emissions mean that we really have no choice but to adapt, whereas we do have a choice on how we act today to limit emissions through mitigation. And my own view is that we should be aiming to embed capacity for adaptation whenever we are thinking of implementing a measure or strategy for mitigation. I think that's increasingly starting to be seen and reflected in the work of the Committee on Climate Change, for example. But we'll return to this idea at the end of the presentation. But I think it's worth noting now that school design standards are continuing to evolve, and that's reflecting both drivers for mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please, Kristen. So for climate change policy, well, I think probably most of us are familiar with the main legislative instrument, which is the UK Climate Change Act, and this really sits at the heart of the building and design and construction industry's response to net zero carbon. In terms of mitigation, this has principally been addressed in the past through essentially progressive tightening of the building regulations, specifically Part L. But for adaptation, we have the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, or the CCRA, and the National Adaptation Programme, or the NAP for short. So the CCRA is published every 5 years by the Committee on Climate Change, and in fact the latest editions are pretty hot off the press, and it was published earlier this month. And that CCRA document goes on to inform wider UK government policy through the NAP, which is published by DEFRA essentially in response to those recommendations. So in the latest version of the CCRA, as in keeping with previous editions, they've looked at the risks of climate change against two scenarios, one that corresponds to global warming of 2 degrees Celsius and one of 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, these two scenarios, the 2 degrees and the 4 degrees global warming, were really taken as the starting point for the industry research project that looked at summertime overheating risk in schools. Next slide, please, Kristen. Before I move on to the project, I just want to say a few words about climate data. If you really want to understand what the future of the climate in the UK is going to look like and how changes in outdoor temperatures might affect our comfort and well-being, we can refer to the excellent information that's published by the Met Office on their climate projections. So the latest set of projections were published in 2018, and you can access more information about how the projections were derived, the underlying data from the UK Climate Projections website. Now, I've given some key facts about the methodology behind the projections on this slide, but I'm not going to go into much about these today, but just to note really that the methodology has changed since the last set of projections were produced back in 2009. If you could skip on to the next slide, please, Kristen. So I'll give a brief summary of some of the additional analysis that underpinned the release of the last set of climate projections. So the Met Office looked at two climate futures, one which was the 2 degrees warming and the other for 4 degrees warming, and then mapped those impacts across the UK. So essentially, the typical kind of headline is that we're heading for warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. That's usually the headline you'll hear when it comes to the impacts of climate change for the UK. But if we just focus on summer temperatures, we're essentially talking about an increase of between 3 to 5 degrees above 1981 to 2000 baseline in southern England, if we're seeing a global warming of between 2 and 4 degrees. Now, I think none of us really would want to contemplate 4 degrees of global warming, but I think it is useful to reflect on some of the detail of these numbers, since most schools won't have been designed, or in fact probably even been exposed to these types of higher summer temperatures. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Kristen. So it was quite timely, really, that this data was presented, because around that time I had been working with the DFE, and we had discussed forming a a working group essentially to look into climate change adaptation specifically, with the aim essentially of sharing knowledge and promoting best practice. And we held a kick-off workshop in early 2019, which went on to explore the type of evidence we felt was needed and the actions that are to be taken in response to climate change. And I've given this photo on the slide, which was one of the boards we used to ask participants to comment on what they felt was important and what they hoped to learn from the project. If you jump on to the next slide, please, Kristen. So following that initial workshop, 2 different work streams were set up. There was a modelling work stream, which focused on testing the performance of recent school designs to the 2 degrees and the 4 degrees global warming scenarios I mentioned previously, whereas the monitoring work stream really aimed to gather in-use performance data on schools. Now, ultimately, the ambition was that these 2 work streams would complement each other and support better decision making for climate change adaptation. Next slide, please, Kristen. So through this working group, we essentially asked designers to remodel the performance of some of their recent school designs they had worked on against the 2 degrees and 4 degrees global warming scenario. So that group essentially comprised consultants and contractors who had been working on what was known as the Priority School Building Programme since 2013 or later. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail again today, but in summary, this modelling work stream essentially involves setting out a brief, developing a pro forma to record the results, and then undertaking independent checks to ensure that we had a consistent approach across the working group. And following that sort of process, we then had detailed results from 11 schools to look at. So if you jump onto the next slide, please, Kristen. So to set the context, the majority of those schools were new build secondary schools and generally in urban or suburban locations. We did have 4 different locations represented in terms of the climate files which we used to represent the future climate conditions, and that were Birmingham, Norwich, Leeds, and London. So we did have some results which were specifically related to a London context. Now, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but there was a mix of sizes from smaller buildings with fairly simple rectangular or courtyard forms up to much larger sort of schools, super blocks, and with a range of glazing proportions as well. So one thing I will notice that across the different schools we looked at, there was one thing which was pretty consistent, which was the ventilation strategy. And the majority of them using what is known as hybrid single-sided ventilation, which is essentially systems that use both natural ventilation and low-energy mechanical fans to deliver the required airflows to the classrooms. So if you jump onto the next slide, Kristen, I'll having prefaced it quite a bit, hopefully, I'll start to sort of delve into some of the results. Now, this chart on the slide shows the number of classrooms that were failing an established overheating criterion with 2 degrees warming. So this was kind of over and above the standards which they were designed to. So what essentially this shows is that there was 1 school where every classroom failed this overheating criterion, that's school A. And in this case, it was only marginally compliant against current design standards, but that additional warming just pushed it over what was defined as the compliance threshold. In the other schools, it was the classrooms that were usually considered to be essentially at a higher risk of overheating. So generally those which were south facing and on the top floor of the school, which were generally failing. And so in some cases, there were no classrooms that failed that criterion, so that's schools B and C. In others, it was there was a sort of fair percentage that didn't meet the criterion. So if you jump onto the next slide, please, Kristen. With 4 degrees warming, as you can see from the graph, the overheating risk was much more severe, with all classrooms having some that failed the overheating risk criterion. In fact, every classroom fails in more than half of the schools. So perhaps not a surprising result in some ways, but essentially this situation appears to be much worse with 4 degrees warming. Now, we only had a small data set of schools to work with here, but essentially the results implied that the majority of schools aren't going to meet current design standards with 4 degrees global warming, and most will struggle with 2 degrees warming. If you jump to the next slide, please. So those really are the headline results from the modelling work stream, which previously presented at another industry event. I'm happy to share some of the detail around that after the presentation. But essentially, as you might expect, there was some variation in the response of different school designs to future warming. And you'd expect that to be the case based upon their location and their environmental design strategy, as well as a number of other factors. But whilst we didn't attempt to compare those design strategies, we would expect that some some approaches would have greater resilience than others. So, for example, cross ventilation over single-sided ventilation. And we also identified some important differences in the way that designers were modelling performance of schools, which could influence the results of overheating risk assessments. If you could jump to the next slide, please, Kristen. So that essentially brings me on to the new design guidance for schools that's going to accompany the school rebuilding programme, which was announced earlier this year. So I'm not really in a position to talk about the detail of the new what's called the S21 specification that is sort of underpinning the SRP. But I've highlighted some text from a recent journal article. Essentially, these new standards will be including new sustainability requirements. But you'll notice, whilst they're talking about mitigation in the quotes here, the text highlighted in yellow will really support climate change adaptation, particularly summertime overheating risks. So, for example, ventilation being a key mechanism by which you can remove heat gains from inside a building. Outdoor learning spaces, if they're appropriately sheltered and shaded, could provide more comfortable conditions during a heat wave, and landscape can also support a range of passive cooling techniques. So if you could jump on to the next slide, please, Kristen. So to conclude, and I guess to return to the idea that I introduced at the beginning of the presentation, we can look to embed adaptation in our approach to mitigation. And I've summarised on this slide a list of measures that might be considered in a school's context. And many of these will be simple and low cost to implement, and really these quick wins should be the priority, particularly if a school is already experiencing some issues with overheating during hotter weather. Others are going to involve more long-term investment in the school, but may also bring longer-term benefits in terms of cutting energy costs and carbon emissions. So yes, that's very much a sort of a quick run through of the industry research project that I helped coordinate and some of the key results that flowed from it. And I just want to give a brief overview. I think some of the measures that I've mentioned on this slide, you'll also see well presented in the GLA's guidance that Annette introduced at the start of the seminar. So on that note, thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Tim. That was really interesting. I mean, it just shows that we can't design for today's conditions. We have to design for tomorrow's conditions, because yes, you know, today has already happened, as it were. So that's obviously a really important takeaway from that. Next, we're going to have Daniel Johns, who's Head of Public Affairs at Anglian Water and Associate Governor at the John Burns Primary School. And he's going to be talking about the John Burns Primary School, a climate resilient school. Daniel is Head of Public Affairs at Anglian Water, which is the largest water company in England, supplying water and water recycling services to 6 million customers in the east of England. He's ex-chair of governors at John Burns Primary School in Battersea and is now leading the school's climate change retrofit project. Over to you, Daniel.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to be here, and to be honest, to follow the last presentation, because we as a school have been going through exactly the kinds of circumstances that Tim was just talking about. Hopefully you can see my slides on the screen. Can I just check, because they're on a separate page for me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So John Burns is a small single form entry primary school in South London, Battersea. It's where my daughter went to school. We moved into the area, and she's now growing through the school out into secondary. But as chair of governors back in 2018, I started getting complaints from mainly from teachers, actually, as also from parents, about conditions within the school building during a run of very hot days, which happened to coincide with SATS week. Of course, you know, Key Stage 2 SATS is really important for the schools themselves and for school children. It's a very stressful time. The last thing you want really is a building that's starting to overheat, get not just into the high 20s, but potentially into the low 30s. And these were some kind of comments lifted from some of the emails and complaints I was getting about the fact that children are suffering from lethargy, continual thirst and sweating, low level feelings of sickness, understandable dips in presentation, spelling and accuracy across the curriculum. You know, even when teachers go into the school building early, open up all the windows, you know, get drinking water out on the tables, turn on the fans on full, they're unable to keep classroom temperatures at a kind of manageable level. Even when getting in early, opening all the windows, the classrooms are already boiling. even though, let's say, ventilation is as good as it possibly can be within that building. So children struggling to focus on class, really difficult conditions for teachers to be teaching in, and in particular during obviously a very stressful time and SATS week. So this is back in 2018, but since then, one of the first things we did was to get a building scientist. Actually, Kristen helped organise for me, which I'm forever grateful for. A building scientist to try and diagnose what the problem was with the school building. And then, unfortunately, it was no single thing. Pretty much every aspect of the school building was not designed with future temperatures in mind. And one of the first things that we did was install Bluetooth temperature sensors just to get a sense of really what the conditions were. And from this quite busy, complicated chart, you can tell, first of all, the grey dotted line in the background is the external temperature. So we have a sensor outside. Obviously showing that during this particular run of days in May 2020, you had temperatures exceeding 35, 36 degrees. But as Tim said, the classrooms really suffering the most were the ones in the upper floor of the building towards the south end. The sun moves across from the east, goes over the school onto the west side. I'll show you a picture in a minute. But those buildings, those classrooms in the south side of the building, with lots of glass, really were suffering from really quite severe internal heat gain. And in one case, actually, one classroom was consistently, or one office was consistently warmer than the temperatures outside. And as governors, we recognised that this wasn't going to get any better. Climate change means that the temperatures that we're seeing now are going to become the norm in the decades ahead. A severe heat wave like in 2003 and in 2018 will become a normal summer by the time we get to 2050. And as the climate change risk assessment came out 2 weeks ago, confirmed that that's now pretty much locked in, regardless of what happens with the Paris Agreement, regardless of what happens at COP26 in Glasgow, regardless of whether we as a country and other countries around the world achieve net zero, we've got at least 1.5 degrees baked in, and possibly 2 degrees or more. So the school was built in the 60s and 70s, obviously before climate change was really recognised as a challenge that was going to come down the track. We're at this point now where we can make a decision whether to try and let schools individually adapt in the best means that they could possibly try, probably install air conditioning at vast expense and exacerbating things like obviously energy bills, urban heat island effect and so forth. But as a school, we didn't want to take that particular path, particularly because the building scientists recognised it and showed that there's a whole manner of different things about the school that need to be tackled. For example, the fact that it's quite a lightweight building, very little thermal mass. It's way too easy for heat to transfer into the building in the summer months, and it's very easy for that heat also to escape the building in the winter. Lots of plate glass in the south, east and west facades. The building is surrounded by essentially its own little mini heat island, the playground. You can see some green spaces towards the top of the school, the north end of the school. But otherwise, it's a typical blend of kind of multi-use, the mugger pitch in the bottom right there, playground spaces and typical asphalt surfacing. So as I say, as governors, we didn't want to just rely on either having to deal with this problem for weeks, potentially each year on an increasingly frequent basis, nor just to rely on air conditioning to solve the problem, but at the expense of these other environmental consequences and higher energy bills, but to think of this more holistically about how we can adapt the school building to be fit for the future climate in ways that will also help to tackle our own carbon footprint, the level of biodiversity and contribution toward better air quality that we can achieve within the area. The fact that we're in a low-lying part of London near the river in an area of surface water flood risk, so how can we capture and attenuate and slow down rainfall before it hits the local sewer? And also, how can we shade the building in the way in which we tackle the building adaptations and potentially also generate our own clean, renewable electricity? And so the core components of the project that we're hoping to take forward in the next 12 months are, first of all, on the large flat roof area, what we're calling a bio-solar roof or a solar green roof, which combines the benefits of green roof in terms of biodiversity, rainwater attenuation, and helping keep those sun's rays off that large grey flat roof area, with the benefits of renewable energy and panels which help shade the school building itself. the outdoor classroom spaces, we've got these very large balcony spaces, which at the moment aren't used very much of the year. They're not shaded. There's very little out there. It's just hard surfacing, which again just heats up itself and contributes towards kind of heat getting into the building. There's this example on the right-hand side of what they call it again, a biosolar pagoda, which is topped by PV panels to generate electricity, provides dappled shade, and the rainwater attenuation is kind of integrated into the design. So you're also capturing rainwater, slowing it down, recycling it if you can before it reaches the sewer. So, and there's a link there if you want to kind of go through to see this example. But certainly we've been really captured by the concept that you can deliver these multiple benefits in ways that also help with the curriculum, with the learning experience of pupils, to create outdoor classrooms which could be used not just in summer, but probably in the spring and the autumn too. Combined with sustainable drainage systems in the playground spaces. And this is an example from my own job at Anglian Water. So it's my team that looks after flooding and sustainable drainage. And we've got a programme specifically working with schools because they have such large areas of impermeable surfacing. If you disconnect a school from the local sewerage network, you create capacity for more foul water to be taken, for growth in housing. And so there's a multiplier effect for every kind of hectare of surface water drainage you disconnect. You're going to connect an extra 1,500 homes or so if all you're taking is their foul water. And again, there's a video there, which is a really cute video of the school children there at All Saints Primary School in Newmarket, introducing SUDS and really showing how excited and kind of passionate they are about the project that they helped deliver for us. So where we are at the moment, first of all, these projects are not easy to get off the ground. We've been talking about this since 2018, and we've had a fair win, let's face it, with the help of Kristen, with the help of other contacts that I've got within the industry, with Wandsworth Borough Council, now with the Department for Education. We got money from the Mayor of London, first of all, really importantly, to make sure we could test the feasibility of the project, test whether or not the roof would be strong enough to take that solar green roof, and also look at the different energy efficiency options that we've got. And we've already taken forward some of those in a whole school LED lighting retrofit, which again helps with our energy bills and reduces internal heat gain from lighting systems, which is now being completed. Importantly, we've got a quite large grant now from the Department for Education to install the solar green roof as a kind of exemplar project, as a test to see whether or not it delivers the benefits in terms of overheating and rainwater attenuation, which we hope that it will. Thames Water have now come on board too to help us design and fund the SUDS landscaping projects in the playground spaces. And they also, as an early step, as a free service to every school, and every school should take this up. Thames Water came in and they looked for leaks. They replaced some of the products, the cisterns, the flushes, just to help the school use as little water as possible. And those audits can save schools thousands of litres per day. But finally, there is one wrinkle. The school roof itself, even though it's strong enough to take the solar green roof, it's not well insulated. And it doesn't really make sense to put a solar green roof on a roof structure which itself is not insulated well enough to achieve kind of the net zero goals in a consistent way. Solar green roofs are obviously help make roofing structures last for longer because they protect it against UV radiation and so forth, but it doesn't make sense to lay it before the insulation itself is in a good enough state. So we're making a final bid both to Wandsworth and to the Department for Education to increase the insulation. So it's more of a kind of net zero consistent standard. And so by the time we add the solar green roof, we've really got a roofing structure which is ready for 2050. So that's where we are. Lots of amazing funding partners and people contributing towards the project. Groundwork London, in particular, having us to design the scheme overall, together the Green Infrastructure Consultancy. And also just a plug for a podcast that I took part in recently, the SciWem Let's Talk Water and Environmental Management podcast, which was co-hosted by Baroness Brown of Cambridge, obviously is chair of the Adaptation Committee at the Climate Change Committee. And as a project, so we're hoping to design this project in a way so it can be replicated. The Bluetooth sensors in terms of temperature help us tell whether or not what we're doing is having an impact, and capturing costs, capturing lessons, capturing barriers and constraints, so that John Burns isn't the only school that can go through this process, that others can learn from us too. and we can help other schools through this process, hopefully as seamlessly and as cost efficiently as possible. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Daniel. That was great. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, lots of fantastic ideas there, but it's really taking a lot to pull it all together, to find all the partners, to find all the funding. It's not a straightforward job by any means. So, you know, it's obviously what we're going to need to do is to be able to streamline this for schools, because not every school can go through this whole process from scratch. And we're now going to be looking at taking action in schools for healthier air indoors. Bryony Turner is the secretary of the Indoor Air Quality Working Party, a group of leading clean air, health and built environment researchers. The Working Party is hosted by the University of Reading, where Bryony is based, and was established in 2018 by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, together with the Royal College of Physicians, who brought together experts from a range of specialities across the UK to investigate the evidence around indoor air quality, and to propose steps to protect the health of children. And all this culminated in a report in 2020 called The Inside Story: Health Effects of Indoor Air Quality on Children and Young People. Over to you, Bryony. Bryony, you might be on mute. There you go.
Right, wonderful. Can you now hear me?
We can hear you, and we can see your slide too.
Super, super wonderful. Because as you all know, with Teams, it takes over your screens. You can't tell what people can see. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this event today. I'm going to go into some details about the Indoor Air Quality Working Party, our recommendations and findings and tips, and a lot of resources for schools. But I wanted to just start. I also sit on London Climate Change Partnership myself, and I'm chair of the vice chair of the SIPSI Resilient Cities Group. So I just wanted to start by connecting the impacts of climate change with indoor air quality. So at the moment, the majority of the research and modelling of the impacts of climate change has very much focused to date on the outdoor environment. Yet particularly during this pandemic worldwide, people are spending increasing proportions of their day inside, and the effects of climate change will mostly be experienced indoors. Climate change is expected to worsen some existing health problems as global temperatures increase, and also to amplify existing risks related to heat exposure, flooding, and chemical and biological contamination in buildings. The quality of building design and construction determines people's vulnerability to flooding, heat, cold, and other extreme weather. And the indoor air quality aspect of that is really, really important. You can end up with a wide variety of pollutants, sometimes during the aftermath of a climatic event, particularly, for instance, after flooding, like mold spores, excess moisture, and then continued damp and problems with that can trigger health effects. So just thought it was important to first of all pause and make the linkage between what we've heard about the changing climate in London, what we're expecting to experience, activities to adapt to the buildings, and then thinking about the indoor environment. I think also because there's some schools in London here, often buildings in London are on previously developed land that have their own histories, and much of London has at times been remediated, and there is a sort of unknown element of what happens as our climate changes to the ground beneath us, and thinking about things like, not so much for London, but radon if you're listening from elsewhere in the country. So ventilation is absolutely crucial indoors. There's a lot of colourless, odourless gases. So just wanted to sort of make those links before I go into the detail of the presentation. So I'll now take you through a little bit about the Indoor Air Quality Working Party and our recommendations, and what you can do in your schools to keep your children safe as our climate changes. So the Indoor Air Quality Working Party advances public understanding, quality of access and experience of healthier indoor air for children and other vulnerable groups in the wider population. And it's made up of a group of mostly UK-based scientists in the fields of health and built environment. And these scientists work together in a working party that was convened by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health and Royal College of Physicians, and published the Inside Story, which I really, really recommend that everyone reads. It was published in 2020, and there's a series of recommendations that came alongside it, and one of those is very specifically to protect school children. There's also a fantastic summary of the consultation that went on of children themselves, their families and carers, and what they wanted to know and understand. And so whilst I'm going to give you some recommendations in terms of the physical buildings, we also hope that our content and information can be brought into the education system to empower children to also call for change and for healthier air indoors and for actions for that. So very specifically for schools, we had 4 sort of sub-recommendations for schools. The first one, very relevant also to adapting buildings to climate change, particularly heat, is to use adequate ventilation. We've heard a lot about the problem stuffy classrooms. If you can smell it, if you can smell a stuffy classroom, that means it's not well ventilated. So it's really important to have that ventilation to prevent the build-up of harmful indoor pollutants, and also that includes viruses like COVID. So in your efforts to tackle COVID, you're also tackling poor indoor air quality as well. However, particularly with schools in London, it's specific to your context, and the building manager needs to look at the outdoor air quality data, the pollen count, and you need to think very carefully about when you're opening the windows, particularly if you have asthma sufferers within the school during high pollen count times. So we recommend that it might be best to try to open windows if you're in a poor air quality area during off-peak periods of traffic, to take account, and also to take account of the pollen forecast and think about that, and the children's conditions, health conditions as well. Ensure classrooms are regularly cleaned to reduce the dust, and that damp or mould is removed. It's not a problem to put in a corner. It's not a problem for later. It's really, really important to tackle it, and to include that high up on your repairs agenda. And to ensure that any air filtering or cleaning devices are regularly maintained, otherwise they can actually present a hazard to health rather than helping it. And then to work with, we would include the Greater London Authority for London, but to work with your local authority through the ambient air quality action plans, and with parents or carers to reduce traffic and idling vehicles close to the school. Why this matters? So we're spending more and more of our lives indoors, and children particularly are spending a greater proportion of their lives indoors than outdoors. We used some ONS data and found that on average children are only spending about 68 minutes of a day outdoors. Possibly a lot of that's actually during the break times at school. So actually indoor air is really, really important to think about and prioritise. Particularly as the exposure during childhood can have lifelong consequences. Children's lungs are most susceptible to the harmful effects from damp, mould and airborne toxins. So often when we're looking at, say, construction projects with the schools, if you've got a new construction or a refurbishment programme, you think about what's the time scale for that, for the build. But at the same time, you need to be thinking about what's the exposure time scale? How long is that for? You know, that could be, for some of these bigger building projects, a whole childhood that you're catering for within that school. So, and then the other aspect is with we've heard about the risks of surface water flooding and other types of flood events in London as the climate changes. It can sometimes be very difficult, I know, to find the budget to make the preventative actions that reduce the impacts of flooding. But when you look at the repairs and the reinstatement after flood events, it's not just the cost, it's also the dust exposure and the other impacts that can happen from excess moisture that can have health effects. So we'd really like you to think about buildings and works, not just in terms of the built environment timescale, but in terms of exposure timescales. So in the inside story, you'll find a really handy, I think it's page 68 it starts, there's a really handy comprehensive annex that goes through the different types of pollutants and the sources of them. And that can be really handy when you're specifying build or refurbishment activities, and also so that you can think about what's going on in your school and where you could take action to reduce fumes and sources of pollutants. So although we've got a picture and a diagram here of a home, most of these are operational activities inside a school. So you've got bathrooms because you have toilet facilities. So it's that mold and mildew I was talking about, but think about also the cleaning products, how well ventilated it is. We encourage using liquid rather than spray cleaning products. Think about your kitchens, the exposure, are you using gas stoves in the catering facilities? What's the ventilation like? Are your cooks actually turning on the cooker hoods when they're cooking? And what we're calling for is high quality health related research to understand more about how the indoor environment influences the health and well-being in vulnerable people, including children. And that there needs to be greater understanding of different exposures in driving adverse health. And we're calling for healthier school and day nursery environments. I think this is mostly schools here, but also thinking about nurseries. Nurseries sometimes are in converted homes that were never designed even with the ventilation in mind for educational environments. So it's really thinking about these aspects. And now I'm going to come on to what you can do. So Ben Jones is one of our working party members, and particularly for this event, he wanted to give some top tips on ventilation in school classrooms. So as he says, use your nose. If it smells when you first enter the space, your space is underventilated. So what can you do? It's really important that you understand how your ventilation system or the design of your school in terms of ventilation works. I'm sure you've been looking at that copiously because of COVID. And windows for the summer, open wide, obviously taking account of the pollen count and the air quality in your surrounds into consideration in the way that you do that. And windows for winter, sometimes we're obsessed with shutting the windows to keep the heat in, but it's really important to maintain a healthy air quality inside. So he suggests opening the higher windows first, so you get the mixing of the air whilst helping to preserve the thermal comfort. And we've already heard that research does suggest that school classrooms are underventilated, and we need to think very carefully as we do the efforts for mitigating for climate change to put in energy efficiency measures and insulation, to think about the air quality impacts of that, to think about maintaining the ventilation, not just trying to seal the school up to keep it as energy efficient as possible. So I'm now going to go through some different sources of useful information for you. There is a specific research project underway under the UK a research and innovation programme called TAPAS, which is Tackling Air Pollution at School. And there'll be more and more resources that come through. That's a project underway now. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail with some of the recommendations that are in the Clean Air for Schools framework. And I made sure that I've given you the link there. And the Global Action Plan have a page on schools as part of their Clean Air Day resource. In London, very specifically, as I think was already mentioned, the cool toolkit of measures to improve indoor air quality at schools. There's also the Hackney School Streets Toolkit as well, which our working party members recommended. So there is a Clean Air for Schools framework. It's a free online tool to help every school create a tailored clean air action plan to tackle air pollution indoors and out and around the school. So I'm just going to show you a little bit what it looks like, but they basically have 4 focus areas around your actual operations and activities in the school. What you can do about tackling air pollution at the school gate. Obviously that's external pollution, but that can become internal pollution if you don't tackle it and you need to ventilate the school. Also to educate the next generation to help them and their families make cleaner air choices. And what you can do in terms of being a leader in your community. So this is some extracts from the, don't worry, I'm not going to read these out, but it's to show you the variety of measures. So on the left, we have the measure, on the right, we have more detailed information about what you specifically can do, like making sure your boiler serviced regularly to keep the burning fuel cleanly. There's all sorts of different examples. I'm going to skip through these because Kristen will make the slides available for you afterwards. And I wanted to get through to some of our resources. So we've produced, as the Indoor Air Quality Working Party, we took very seriously that children and young people wanted to be empowered with the information. They wanted the information for their parents as well. This shouldn't just sit with building managers and building service engineers. So we've produced tips for healthier air at home. So we've got resources, which is information for health practitioners. So do make sure, that your school nurse is aware of this and can look at this resource. And then we've also got clean air at home tips for parents. They can download, there's a PDF that can be downloaded and printed out, but it's also all online. And we started working on social media to try and put these sort of visual tips out with then further information and links to further resources. We also have prepared worksheets that can be integrated into your school lesson plans. If you've got air quality monitors that you're using, I know that some schools are using carbon dioxide monitors to give an idea of level of ventilation in a classroom, whether windows need to be opened and things like that. We've got some worksheets and activities that the children can do. So that's an example. We've actually got physical packs, but they're all downloadable online as separate worksheets and then answer sheets as well. And we really wanted to reiterate our sort of three areas of action in any building, which is, first of all, you want to avoid pollutants being generated or brought indoors. If you can't avoid, then you need to make sure that where possible, you remove the sources of pollutants indoors with known health effects. And if it's very difficult or not possible to avoid or remove, then you're looking at reducing exposure to and use of pollutants, and you make sure you've got adequate ventilation if you can't remove the sources of the pollutants. So some of the other useful resources around thinking about the pollen aspect and triggers for asthma. There is advice on tree planting recommendations for species to reduce so that there's species that don't have the pollen that can trigger that. So there's some useful resources there from Prashant Kumar at the University of Surrey. There are knowledge gaps around. There's plenty of knowledge to take preventable action, but there are also sort of knowledge gaps. We need far more of a research focus on those knowledge gaps, particularly around mixing of chemicals indoors. So that's why I've pointed you to the UK Clean Air programme, which is trying to address gaps not just in indoor air quality but outdoor air quality too. I also wanted to point you in the direction of the UK Climate Resilience Programme. There's actually a very specific embedded researcher project on school buildings adaptation and resilience. So that might be of interest. And then there are some resources that are educational resources just in relation to climate change. I thought you might find useful for your educational activities and in your schools. This is the Challenging the Climate Crisis, the Children's Agency project. Great resources on that. There's also a drought-related project that has a lot of resources to bring science into the classroom. And I think I'll pause it at that, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, that was fantastic, Bryony. So many resources for everybody. Thank you very much. So we're seeing, I think, several themes emerge through all the presentations. One is that all this work can help the children's learning if as well. Something that people haven't really mentioned is, of course, well, of course, all this is important for the children because they're at a very vulnerable age, but there's all the people working in schools too, some of whom may be vulnerable for other reasons. So it's not just the children we need to think about, it's everybody. Now, we've had some questions in the chat. Do please put more questions in the chat, or raise your hand using the raise hand button if you want to ask a question. Mariana asked, I think this was probably for Daniel, but I'd be interested in hearing views from other people. Have you considered water mists or fountains? So any water-based cooling, for example?
I saw that question. I was wondering how water efficient that would be. You know, London is an area of severe water stress. So unless there was some way of recycling the water, which I'm not sure there would be, yet that's not necessarily something that we would do. But certainly, you know, I guess as governors, we came at this as amateurs. Really, we didn't know what the school would need in order to adapt it. And I think that's why it's really quite encouraging to hear today that there is guidance coming about. You know, one question I would like to ask, if it's okay, is should the school install cavity wall insulation? Obviously, from a winter insulation perspective, that would be really good. Would that also help in terms of overheating? Because I've heard that unless you do it well, then you can exacerbate overheating issues if you don't insulate a building properly. I've also heard horror stories from cavity wall insulation not being done well, and it can cause all kinds of damp problems and everything else. And it's those kind of inconsistencies and lack of kind of trusted independent advice that's out there that means it's very difficult for individual schools to be making what they feel to be confident in as the right choices.
Could the other panelists welcome to turn their videos on again at this stage? And I'd be very interested in hearing from any of them where they think sort of you really want a sort of single trusted source of information, don't you, Daniel? You don't want to have to go shopping around everyone, which is essentially what you're doing at the moment. Do any of the other panelists have any ideas on how schools can approach this problem? Everyone's looking very blank. Okay.
Just to say, Louise, that at the GLA, Daniel, we do have a team that works on energy efficiency measures in school. So there's an opportunity there to contact our schools team. I'm not so sure they'd know necessarily the technicalities, but they'd certainly be able to put you in touch with suppliers who would be able to advise. And you're absolutely right, there is the adaptation versus mitigation unintended consequences. You make buildings so energy efficient, you make them so tight in the summer, they're overheated, and then we reach for the mechanical cooling, which is of course what we don't want to do. So yes, it's one of those unintended consequences issues. But yeah, we can put you in touch with our energy efficiency team who have worked in schools if you already don't have that contact.
That'd be great, thank you.
And Kristen, are you trying to come in on this one? Do come in.
Well, sort of. I mean, I just saw that there was also a question or sort of slight comment from Matt about trying to implement some of this guidance and working with local authorities to do that. And I think, you know, as Annette mentioned, you know, we have disseminated some of this guidance and stuff like that. But I was also just thinking, and Matt also raised the point that, you know, there are new climate change officers working in local authorities, and there is a new resilient and green working group led by London councils that's just setting itself up, led by Southwark Council. So, you know, perhaps there's an opportunity there for us to kind of bring some of this into there and try to, you know, generate, you know, that collection of information that people can draw from. So that we can learn from experience like Daniel's, rather than kind of having everyone reinvent it all the time.
Yeah. Dan, you were trying to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, it was only a kind of general comment. I mean, I think this is precisely something we're starting to look at, actually, and you know, we're starting to look at how we might develop adaptation plans for schools. So it's really, you know, not particularly helpful for Daniel right at this moment if he's looking to, but you know, it's going to be like a suite of measures around you know, sort of high density materials rather than lightweight materials, and combining with shading and that sort of thing. But I mean, I don't have a definitive answer at this stage, only to say we are going to work with our sort of mitigation colleagues to make sure we pick up these adaptation questions.
Thank you. And I think we've got Mariana is saying, coming back. Mariana, do you want to unmute yourself and put your question directly? It's probably easier than me trying to read it out.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, it's just a comment. So the question came because I'm part of research group studying water-based cooling. So I was wondering if it was at the table, so it's interesting to know. So thank you. Yeah, no further questions. Thanks.
Thanks. And Sue, do you want to come in with your question here?
I've got so many questions.
Yeah.
One in particular you'd like to look at?
Well, no, just I was looking at your most recent question about retrofit guidance.
Well, I'm always quite so. We did our tree species guidance, which covers a lot of things on tree species, but I'm always quite interested in how to get things tied together so that everywhere anybody turns for any information, they always get the same information, and we avoid these confusing sieves. So I'm just quite interested that, you know, DFE are sort of trundling along on their path about school retrofit. Other people, you know, we're sort of tying it all together so we have kind of unified information.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we're doing in London schools, maybe it's being groundbreaking, but it's got to spread out over the entire country. I mean, there's a kind of schools crisis going on out there, in fact, in terms of building performance.
Daniel, is your reply to this question?
Well, yes, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. I mean, so we've been talking to the kind of the flood risk management part of DFE for some time, and actually the funding for the project, interestingly, is coming from the flood risk benefits. And part of the challenge of getting projects like this to be funded is because you have to go to 6 different funders to get their contribution towards the benefits that they recognise, rather than, wouldn't it be great if there was a school climate change retrofit pot, which projects like this could bid for? That doesn't exist as yet. But your point about tying this in with the mitigation side of things, absolutely. So we're also talking to the design standards part of DFE, who are thinking about John Burns, because it is a kind of archetypal school. There are thousands of schools like John Burns with very similar construction across the whole country, not just in London. And if we can do it in a way which can be repeated, can obviously, every school is different, but at the same time, they face very similar challenges. And their interest in particular is if they are specifying design standards for retrofit projects to be consistent with achieving net zero by 2050, how do you do that in a way which also means that you kind of do it once, as opposed to going back to each school every decade or two to upgrade to whatever building regulations have to be at that time? So that's a really interesting conversation. We hope that some of the extra money, the last chunk of money we might need, will come because of that kind of aspect of the project that we're trying to deliver.
So one of the real problems is that a lot of these interventions, these retrofits, do have a lot of benefits, but there are a lot of different benefits that would fall under different funders, as it were. So it's the coordination that's so difficult. Yeah. In the recent CCC report, there was a lot of publicity around the fact that we've had quite a few new houses built in the last few years, and basically they were built to standards that aren't going to be appropriate for the future. So we've built up this huge retrofit backlog for ourselves, essentially, without even trying. Has the same thing happened on schools? I mean, I assume with all this new housing, there have been new schools built to go along with it. And are we going to face the same problems with schools? Do any of the panelists know anything about that? No? Okay. Brian,
I can perhaps say a few words.
Tim, great.
Yeah, so I mean, the DFE design team, it sounds like Daniel, who's you've been engaging with them, they have undertaken a number of building performance evaluation studies of some of the more recently designed schools. So I think they have some feedback of how different schools are performing, and I presented along with Herschel Patel some of that data at an event a couple of years ago now, actually. So I'd happily share that to you. They give some feedback both from the premises manager and also teachers on how they're finding summer conditions. So it often feels like a bit of a cop out to say this, but it's inevitably a bit of a mixed picture. I think in relation to have things, are new energy efficient schools increasing the risk of overheating? I think that's in all likelihood going to be very much linked to how effectively the school has been designed to sort of enable purge ventilation, which is a kind of a fundamental kind of concept to removing heat gains from buildings. So where the school's ventilation systems either aren't kind of adequately sized, dimensioned, or aren't performing as intended because perhaps they weren't commissioned properly, I think that's where, for me, there are kind of warning signs. And now, the expense at which to sort of kind of address those issues is going to vary again on a school by school basis. But I think the set of challenges in residential are quite different, in the sense that I think a lot of those probably ones which are going to be most at risk will have been single-sided ventilation with poorly ventilated cores, essentially, especially the kind of London high-rise developments. So I think those are the ones which I think we'll see the most concerns. I don't think hopefully the situation is quite so bad in schools, I would hope, but I'm not aware of sort of a comprehensive study that's looked into that, but they are looking into it. I think that's the thing to sort of be aware of.
Right. Bryony?
Yes, I wanted to take the opportunity to point out, particularly when we're talking about the kind of adaptation and energy efficiency retrofit side of things, that we need more thought about what's going to happen whilst that building work's going on. Schools normally have to continue to operate and run. It never works over the summer holidays. And that perhaps some of the ways in which you would sequence and even some of the materials and the construction types that you might choose or advocate as the GLA with your value for money efficiency sort of part of your calculator versus what would be a healthier environment for children to be educated in during the build. The Indoor Air Quality Working Party would like to see more thought about the exposure and the different types of exposure implications for during educational term time from some of the different construction options, that should be a factor in your consideration, not just value for money, and that perhaps this is something that the London could be leading in terms of taking in that kind of quality of life aspect into its consideration, and perhaps there could be a fund or something there to help those schools without the means to be able to take the healthier course of action if that does cost more. I think also the onus needs to also be pushed back from schools onto those in the construction industry, those manufacturers of the products, of the materials for building construction, to say, we don't want to be having to spend our scarce funds reducing exposure of children. We want you to stop using the products that give off the VOCs, etc., and for you to make more effort in the supply chain so that we're not presented with the end problem.
This is a great example of something I think we're seeing all over this picture, is that it's a big systems problem, that everything interconnects, that you've got the energy efficiency for mitigation interconnecting with the overheating problems, you've got the cooling issues interconnecting with the drainage and water use problems, you've got the retrofitting interconnecting with the air quality, which is of course itself exacerbated by overheating and air quality are right there. You just can't look at any of these in isolation. And it's very difficult, I think, for the schools to navigate their way through all this. and also, but it's very good to see some of the excellent work that's going on in the GLA and in various industry and professional groups that are thinking about this and trying to draw all these threads together. So thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to the brilliant panel of Daniel, Dan, Tim, Annette and Bryony. Thanks very much to Kristen for putting all this together. We have recorded the session and it will be available. Also, there'll be all the presentations, a huge number of resources in the various presentations and in the chat, and all those will be available to everybody on the LCCP website and presumably eventually on the London Climate Action Week website as well. So also, if you'd like to be kept informed about any particular project, do add something to the chat or drop Kristen a line, and we'll make sure to put you in touch with the relevant people. So thank you very much to all the audience for your great questions and to the panelists for their great presentations. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.